I am so excited to introduce you to the two women, the two sisters who you are about to meet. You already know them, you're about to know them even better. But before I do that, I want to offer some framing for this particular panel that you're about to experience. So as you know, this gathering is part of a much larger movement, a movement that is insisting on grounding the resistance in the ethic of love, a movement that is insisting in making love a public ethic in the United States. And so, because love is perhaps the most abused word in the English language, we have to be really serious and robust about what that means. And the working definition that we are using, that the Love Army, the Revolutionary Love Project, our partners at the Women's March, V-Day, in the mass mobilizations that we are carrying out with our partners at Auburn Seminary, including Middle Church, the definition that we are using reclaims love through a feminist lens. This is why we are framing love as a form of sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, life-giving, a choice we have to make over and over again. And we are saying that when we pour this kind of labor in three directions, loving others who may not look like us, loving opponents who disagree with us, and loving ourselves, who we too often neglect, then love becomes revolutionary. So revolutionary love is the choice to enter into labor for others, opponents, and ourselves. All great nonviolent social movements were grounded in the ethic of love. But on the lips of Dr. King, Gandhi, Mandela, they taught us so much about how to love others and how to love our opponents. They didn't talk that much about how to love ourselves. So this is the feminist intervention that we are making. And we are drawing from our womanist sisters like Bell Hooks, who insist that the movement can no longer happen on our backs or over our dead bodies, that our suffering ought not be mistaken for public service. And so laboring for ourselves matters in this movement. In fact, laboring for ourselves is the only way that women can become warriors and last out there in the movement. My question then is how? So far, the only terminology we have is self-oriented, as if self-care is possible when you are dying or struggling or laboring. But we as women know that you do not labor in birth alone. You do not birth alone. You do not die alone. And we ought not to labor in our movement alone. We need each other. Self-care is insufficient. So wraparound care, community care. How are you breathing? Who are you breathing with? Every single day, because only in breathing do we find joy. And joy is what keeps us laboring for the long haul. How? How do we labor? I want to share one insight that will plant a seed for us as we begin this conversation. When I was laboring on the birthing table, it was my mother who whispered in my ear, "You are brave." Now, she saw something in me that I could not in that moment. And because I could see myself through her eyes, then I could finally give birth to my son. When I was at the deathbed of my dear friend just a few days ago, I looked into her eyes and I gave her the same words, "You are brave." And because she saw herself through my eyes, she could then push through the pain and have the most dignified death that was possible. After the election, as an activist, like so many of us who have been in this movement for a very long time, it was so dark and it was so painful that I heard in my mind for the first time in my life a voice say, "I prefer non-existence to this." It was my sisters who whispered in my ear, "No, you are brave. You are brave." And I had to see myself through their eyes to know that I was strong enough to do this. The first Sikh woman warrior, her name was Mai Bago. The story goes there was a great battle. 40 soldiers abandoned their post in the year 1705, returned to this village, and this village woman turned to them and said, "You will not abandon your post. You will return to the battle, and I will lead you." She mounted a horse, she donned a turban, and with a sword in her hand and fire in her eyes, she led them where no one else would. She became the one she was waiting for. We need the women warriors in our lives to take our hands and lead us, because here's the truth. I am the deserter as much as I am the woman warrior. And I need my sisters in those moments when I want to abandon my post to take my hand and say, "Oh, my love, it's okay. It's okay, I know it's hard. Let's put your body in some hot water, like our friend Jody did for me the other night. Let's put some Epsom salts. All right, you soaking, good. All right, breathing, okay. All right, now let's go get arrested." Let's share the stage together. Let's build this movement. Breathe and then push. And so the women who are my closest sisters are the ones who will take my hand and lead me back. The women who are my closest sisters are the ones who let me take their hand and lead them back. And I say all this because that is how women warriors are leading right now. Only together. And I say all this because the two women I'm about to bring onto the stage, you're going to see as women in our celebrity culture, as women warriors who are standing alone or sparkling in their own light. And what you do not see, what is invisible, is how much labor, how much work they're doing and saying and making the women around them believe that they are brave. And I am so grateful to be one of them. And so you want to meet them? So, you already know them. She is called one of the most influential rabbis in America. She decided that our religious institutions were not meeting the spiritual needs of a new generation or the social justice challenges of our time. And so she decided just to create her own community, her own synagogue in Los Angeles called Ikar. That was in 2004. Today, it is a vibrant community. It is a life-giving community. Her voice is prophetic. Her community is on the front lines of social justice work. She is revitalizing not only Judaism, but the life of faith in America. And I'm so proud to call her my friend and my sister, Rabbi Sharon Brous. Now, you all know her on the screen. You know her as an Emmy Award-winning actress. You know her for her roles that, whether as Betty Suarez in Ugly Betty, or in Real Women Have Curves, or Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, or right now, Superstore, which is on NBC right now. You know her as a woman who has taken on roles that aren't just models of talent on the screen. She has inspired an entire generation of young women and women of color to look up and see themselves represented in a world where they were invisible before. When she's not on set, we see her on stages. We see her at the Women's March. We see her on the stage of the Democratic National Convention. We see her in the streets mobilizing the Latino community to vote. We see her campaigning for Hillary Clinton. And after the election, when she told me that she wanted to give up, it was her husband who sat with her and took her hand. And it was her friends who let her back in to remind her of the woman warrior she was. And she co-founded this organization called Harness, that is creating spaces that have never existed before. Harness is bringing together artists, activists, Hollywood influencers, and grassroots leaders to build new partnerships. And this is how I got swept up into her world and on stages inside of Hollywood, telling my stories that I could never get into before. And she has been one of the key leaders of Time's Up. Time's Up, declaring that time is up on silence, not only in Hollywood, but across industries when it comes to the abuse of women. And it's not just lip service. They have created a multi-million-dollar fund to help women who have far less privilege than us be able to break their silence in the face of their abuse. So I say all this because America Ferrera is not just an artist. She is an activist at her core. And what you have not seen, and what I have had the privilege of seeing in the last year, is how tirelessly she works, how tirelessly she labors. She's the one who's staying up until 2 in the morning, making sure everything is right before the next great event, before the campaign. Because with her blood, sweat, and tears, she believes that it is possible to give her baby a more just world than this. America, you are here, and we are so grateful that you are here. So you can see how much I love them. So we are going to talk about Me Too and Time's Up and this moment in this movement, but I want to start with the inner work. I want to start with the invisible labor that I was starting to name that makes possible the labor and the movement out there. And I know that there may be women in the audience who look at the stage and put us on a pedestal and say, I can't be that. And so I want to start in the early years, when both of you were in spaces where you were just guests in male-dominated spaces, whether it was the religious world or the world of Hollywood, and what that process was like for you, from being a guest into the space to unlocking the wisdom inside of you and becoming leaders in that space. And my love, I want you to start.
I'm gonna need you to go easy on me, Valarie. I have a lot of hormones, and You've already made me tear up, so if you could dial it back just a little bit.
She cannot.
I know you can't. You've got one setting. We all have one setting. I also have one setting, just at the moment it's down. I'm so grateful to be here, and I would do anything for you, and I'm always so grateful to be welcomed into the beautiful communities that you are a part of and leading and inspiring. For me, I wasn't just a very young woman trying to break through in a male-dominated space. I was a very young, brown, poor, undereducated, unconnected, unpolished woman who didn't fit the standards of anyone's version of what they wanted to see in stories and on screen. And I think there's a blessing there is a blessing in youth and naivete and in believing everything that you are told, that that dreams, your wildest dreams are possible in America, and all you have to do is work really hard and keep showing up, and those doors will open. And I believed what I had been told my whole life. I believed it to my core, and I was one of the very, very fortunate, lucky ones who happened to be in the right places at the right time. And early on, my friends, my family members, my teachers, my classmates, they very much rolled their eyes at my dream to become an actress, a storyteller. They would try and temper my expectations of I think they thought they were protecting me by saying, not a lot of people make it, and even less people who look like you or come from where you come from. And so, I think back then it was just sheer stubbornness and sheer naivete. And also I felt something like fate or something like destiny pushing me forward. And, the things that they thought would make it impossible for me to break through, my brownness, my my poorness, my lack of some fancy education as an actress, those things that had been put on me as what would hold me back were actually, at the end of the day, the very things that equipped me to step into the roles that I played and empowered me to, as you say, represent people who had never seen themselves on screen before. And I am the first to say I was in the right place at the right time. I worked hard to be in the right place at the right time, but I know how much luck was involved in me getting a role like Real Women Have Curves, where the playwright, Josefina Lopez, had written that play for herself when she was 19, and it took her 11 years to get it made. You know, I was 7 years old when she started trying to make Real Women Have Curves a reality. So the fact that, you know, I happened to be 17 at the time that somebody would open a door for that story to be told, I acknowledge and understand how much blessing there is in that and how much grace there is in that and how I have nothing to do with that timing. So I very early on, I mean, I just wanted to do what I loved, and I would have done anything. I had no standards or morals around the work that I wanted to do. I would have done an Oreo cookie commercial. I went out on a lot of auditions that were quite dehumanizing. I mean, my very, very first audition, I've told this story before, so I apologize if you're hearing it again, but you know, I came in and it was like a cable commercial for, you know, something you only see at like 3 a.m, and it was like about bail bonds or something, and it was like, "Daddy, when are you coming home?" Like, sort of, it was really sad. And I came in and I did the audition, and the casting director, it was my very first audition ever, and she looked at me and she said, "That was great. Can you do that again, but sound more Latino?" And I was so confused. I was like, "Do you want me to speak Spanish?" And she's like, no, you speak in English, but just like sound more Latino. And I was like, "Oh, okay, I am Latino, and this is what I sound like, so isn't this what Latinos sound like?" And she was like, "Okay, thank you so much, bye." And I left, and I didn't get the job. And I was, you know, it was so quick early on that I realized, you know, the box, it wasn't that there was no place for me to go. There were very few places for me to go in the industry, but the few places where they wanted me to go were places that were stereotypes, and they were dehumanizing, and they diminished me, and there wasn't room for my dignity, and there wasn't room for my experience, and I had to learn that really early on. So I didn't have a choice but to become an advocate for myself if I wanted to do what I love to do with any shred of dignity.
Can you just tell the manager story?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I got this amazing movie, Real Women Have Curves. It was the first film I ever did. It went to the Sundance Film Festival. It traveled the world, won awards. I won awards. You know, in less than a year, I went from never having a job to you know, having a career and having a fancy manager and a fancy agent. And I was in my first year in college trying to continue my acting career and go to school for international relations. And I kept getting these audition roles for like the Chola #2, or, you know, the, you know, gangster's girlfriend, or the chubby Latina sassy sidekick. And I called my manager at the time, and I said to him, "I don't want to go out for these things. Like, where are the roles where I can just be a person?" And he was like, "Oh, okay, I hear you. Didn't have the guts to say it to me on the phone, a 17-year-old, but turned around and said to someone else who represented me, somebody needs to tell that girl that she has unrealistic expectations of what she can achieve in this industry. And I was like, okay, bye. And I fired him, but he wasn't wrong. He wasn't, looking at the evidence, he wasn't wrong, based on what was being written, not written, and written for somebody who looked like me. Like, this is what there was. And what he wanted was for me to tailor my expectations to what was already happening versus having a vision for what was possible and having a vision for what I knew was possible. Because I had just starred in this film called Real Women Have Curves that was about a 17-year-old Latina girl who wanted to go to college in East LA, but we traveled the world with it. And everywhere we went in the world, men, women, old, young, gay, straight, they came up to me and said, that's me, I'm that girl, I'm that little Mexican girl in East LA. And so you don't travel the world and see the possibility of what my story or what someone's story like me could be and mean to people and then get told, lower your expectations. Like, that was contrary to everything that I had just witnessed myself. So things like that could have and do on a daily basis discourage young people from following their dreams and seeing themselves and seeing that it's possible to be out in the world. I had to come up against a lot of those things early on, and I, because of my makeup and who I am, they emboldened me and strengthened me, and I kept pushing. But I think all the time about the young people who, at no fault of their own, believe those things that they get said and are told to them. But I still, obviously I'm in a different place, but I still have to deal with things that, for so long, and I'll stop talking, Sharon, because I want to hear you talk about for so long, even in success, my heart would break at things that I realized or things I began to feel like that will never happen for me. I will never have that opportunity. And the voice, the little critic in my head was, made it about me and my ego and my pride and my selfishness and my ambition and how, I didn't really deserve any of it anyway, so what right did I have to be upset about something I thought belonged to me? And I allowed it to be about that until one day, for not the first time in my career, I was told something like, we have to cast the white character first and then we'll come back to casting this character. And I started weeping. And I just thought, really, America, after all these years, like, this is still your response to rejection? And all of a sudden, like, a light bulb went off in my head. And I realized it wasn't about rejection. It was about the sense of feeling so dehumanized, so unimportant. The fact that a whole chain of people could say that out loud. We need to find the white person first, and then we'll come back to casting this character of color. And that they accepted it as okay, and that I accepted it as okay, and I accepted it as my place. I had to take the anger off of myself and the judgment off of myself and start acknowledging that for what it was, which was a system of dehumanizing. And those are things that we all face in all of our industries, and one that I've been very fortunate to push through, but nonetheless, it exists and is there.
So what strikes me about that is that the voice of the manager and all of those voices in the industry who are insisting on not seeing you, on dehumanizing you, is the same voice as the little critic inside of your own head. And so I'm really interested in how we quiet the voice of the little critic to allow what we're calling like the wise woman to speak inside of us. And so when I think about America in those early years, I think about you, Sharon, in rabbinical school, and how you didn't see any reflections around you of what you knew was possible. And so I want to know how you found the wise woman in you to become who you are today.
First of all, I thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this. And when I walked into this beautiful sacred space this morning, I burst into tears and then cried for the next 4 hours also. As my beautiful friend and sister Jackie has truly built a sacred home here, and I know for so many of you it's so nourishing, and it's just an absolute pleasure to see it live. So thank you, and thank you to Valarie, also my sister, and I know that you are the little sister to Valarie, and I'm the big sister, the very old sister. So we're like family now. We're mishpacha, as we would say. So. I'm really honored and very blessed to be in this conversation with all of you. And so much of what you just shared, America, really resonates with me. I will say, to some extent, it was also for me a combination of ignorance and stubbornness that led me into the space that I'm in, which really had only closed doors for me. I mean, there's no reasonable outcome to my story that would land me where I am right now. And if I were more attentive to the signals and signs, I would have long ago left this field. And I would, I hope I would be a doctor and helping save people's lives somehow or something, but I stayed. So I'm a rabbi and hopefully also trying to save people's lives on some level. But through a combination of ignorance and stubbornness, kind of pushed my way into a space that had no intention to have me in it. I went on a very long journey of epiphanies that ultimately led me to Jerusalem when I was in my junior year of college. And I started to study Talmud for the first time in my life. And this is our sacred literature written 2,000 years ago by men who were grappling with a world that they could not make sense of, going through a time of tremendous trauma and crisis when the sacred center of their faith was destroyed and the people were sent into exile, and they wondered if there would be anything left of their tradition, and started having these conversations, which ultimately were written down and became the stories of our people. And I began to study, and I just fell in love. I fell in love with these men. I fell in love with their arguments, with their conversations, with the endlessness of it. It was like this relentlessness that if you've ever met a Jew, you know what I'm talking about. It's like the conversation never ends. And I was like completely enamored. And I also recognized as I dove into these conversations that I was nowhere to be found in the pages of my own sacred literature. And it wasn't just me. I mean, it was millions of people. It was at least half the population of our people over the course of thousands of years that had voices and spoke, but our words weren't recorded. And I began to, as many Jewish women before me have, become even more interested in the white space between the black letters as I was in the black letters on the page themselves, trying to imagine what happens in the void in between the words that are written down. And I realized one day, in particular, when I was studying that year, I was learning a famous rabbinic text written 2,000 years ago where the rabbis were trying to determine what the compensations should be after a sexual assault. And they argue that a woman who's been assaulted needs to be compensated on 5 different counts. So there's physical pain. Isn't there some emotional trauma? I think there is, because I once heard my maid whispering with another maid, and she said that there's some emotional trauma. And isn't there also loss of work? Because I once heard my sister say that sometimes women can't go back to work right away after they've been traumatized. And I realized they desperately needed me. They needed us, that they couldn't do this well without us. And I think that a sane and reasonable and less stubborn person would have just fled for the hills, and instead I was like, well, here I am. You didn't know it, but you've been waiting for me for 2,000 years. So I suspect that in other faith traditions here, many of those who've been voiceless and invisible in years past have felt this way as well. My name in Hebrew is Chana. I don't really know why my parents gave me that name, but I found Chana in those years. Chana is a fierce warrior, a woman who was striving to conceive. She desperately wanted a child, and she couldn't get pregnant, and all the other women were pregnant, like any woman who's ever struggled with fertility. When you go to the supermarket and you're like, really? Really? Every single woman who, like right now in the cereal aisle, but not me. And that was Chana, and she and her family went up to Shiloh to offer a sacrifice, as they always did. And there were rules about how religion worked. You walked up the mountain, you offered a sacrifice, you ate lunch, and you went home. But Chana was in anguish, and she decided, if religion's anything, it's my moment to bare my heart to God. And she climbs up this mountain and she cries out in agony. And the priest who guards the door doesn't understand what's happening, and he thinks she's drunk, and he yells at her, "How could you come in here and desecrate this space?" And she says, "This is no holy space if it cannot hold a broken-hearted woman's tears." And I thought, this woman is teaching us what it means to be a person of faith, what it means to be a woman in a culture, in an environment, in a system that does not want to see you, but where your tears are needed. And I have felt so many times over the course of my years in this space when I'm constantly banging my head against the wall, and I hear the words of our great teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who once wrote, sometimes you're just banging your head against the wall again and again and again, then you realize there's meaning even in banging your head against the wall. There's meaning even in that. And I still think, yeah, but you know what? It would be nice if someone just opened the damn door, because I'm getting really bruised. So I think of Chana, and I think, even the rabbis, the all-male rabbinic set that wrote our sacred texts, they knew that Chana was a warrior, and they used her work, her spiritual work, as the model for what each of us is to bring when we come in. We don't walk into sacred spaces to recite words that are meaningless and empty, but to bare our anguished hearts and to give love to each other and to give comfort to each other. And so I'm constantly thinking, where does this picture need to be reshaped? Because finally, a broken-hearted woman's going to be heard in this space. So this is part of the journey. For me to learn that I had the right to do that then took many years. I was there and I was insistent, and I also have that disease that so many young women have, which is I actually want people to like me. And so I was fierce, but I also wanted you to like me at the end of the day. And so it took a while for me to realize that I don't know how many years I have on this earth, and I kind of don't give a damn anymore. So I remember, I will share just two things. I know we got a lot of track to cover. So I remember one night when I led Shabbat services in this new community that we had built in Los Angeles called Kaur, because I really felt that when people were fleeing, I read the article in our binder about millennials fleeing church. They're fleeing synagogue too, you should know. It was kind of a comfort for me to realize that it wasn't only the Jews, but also around the country we see this trend. That part of the reason that people are fleeing religion is not because of God, and it's not because of ritual, and it's not because they reject community, and it's not because they don't have spiritual hunger. It's because they reject rigid institutional spaces that don't make space for us to be human and don't challenge us to see the humanity in each other. And so so we built this space because we said we're just going to start from scratch and make our own culture and play by our own rules. And one night after I led services, one of our early, our second or third time doing Shabbat services, one of my dear friends, who's a professor of history, he's the head of the history department at UCLA and a very well-known professor of Jewish history, and he came up to me after services and he said, "Sharon," like Shifra Bronsnick would say, "Sharon, look at me." He said, "Your smallness is taking up too much space in this room." And I was so hurt. And I realized he was so right, that women, that we try to be small. Because even when we're being brave, we don't want to take up too much space. And then at some point, we need to break the barriers. We need to push the boundaries out and make space for something really different and really new. Valarie started by talking about sisterhood and how we need to support each other in doing that. And I believe that that's right. I think we have to help each other be brave because every single message we're getting from our society is telling us to sit down and shut up. And if we're going to stand up and use our voices, we actually need to remind each other that we can. So.
Yes. Oh, so, yes. These are what our tea dates are like, everybody. We're just missing tea. So it strikes me how much bravery is required just to enter these spaces where we have been previously invisible and unwelcome. And then now, to keep us in our place, we have the added, prevalent, constant challenge of being seen through the eyes of men who see us as bodies, as objects, and the constant threat of sexual harassment and then sexual abuse makes it almost impossible for so many women across industries to be more than a quiet voice, a small voice in the room. That feels like for the first time in history, it began to change last fall with 2 little words, Me Too. And I want to say that those words have decades behind them, of so many women who have been blazing the path to get us to be able to say Me Too. It's why that moment is not a moment, but a movement. And you both have been central voices in that movement. And so I want to ask you now of what it has felt like, what this moment has felt like, and what has been invisible. Because America, we've seen you on the red carpet. Actresses with activists, arm in arm, as working women into spaces. We have never seen that before. We've seen the public. What we haven't seen is the different way that you as women are learning to be together in an industry where you had competed with each other before, in an industry where you weren't given opportunities to make connections with women who are less privileged than you. And you have been at the forefront of that. And so to give us an insight into what we can't see up there and what you've been actually doing behind the scenes.
I agree with you that, I feel like my education as an activist has led me to understand that it doesn't matter what I'm doing, and it doesn't matter what we're doing. What matters is how we're being with one another and who we're being with one another. And I can walk into any space and be ready to do, to save, to help, to shed light and put out a helping hand. But oftentimes, no one wants that. They don't need me to save them. They would like for me to be with them and see them and witness them and hear their story and experience them as people. And through being with each other in a new way, the doing takes care of itself. You know what you have to do once you're in relationship to somebody in a new way. I don't have to come up with a clever hashtag to remind myself to care about the person who I just spent 2 hours being with. And I have to say, for me, I thank you for your vulnerability earlier in saying that you are the deserter as much as you are the warrior, because I feel that same way so many times, and there can be a lot of shame around that. But me too, hashtag me too. had years of kind of being out there as an activist, campaigning, registering communities to vote, and felt devastated after the 2017 election. Devastated in a way that my privilege allowed me to be devastated. And there were key things that pulled me out of that. The first was watching your video and reframing this moment for me and for all of us, of changing the perspective of it, feeling like the darkness of the tomb, feeling like, God, it would be so easier to close my eyes and go away than have to open my eyes and confront what is in front of us. That your words and your wisdom and what you brought forward into the world was a starting point for me to get back up on my feet. And then I will say, I have to say, the Women's March changed how women were being with each other in this country and in this world. And that, when I think about the tireless work and energy that, forget organizing the march, just the intentionality of who led that, how they led, their determination that they lead an intersectional group of women. Nothing is perfect, and we can sit here, we can poke holes into anything, and certainly, millennia of trauma is going to always follow us wherever we go, in any movement, into any space, and we have to confront that and we have to deal with that. But the courage and the bravery of what these women did, of what Linda and Tamika and Carmen and Bob and all of them, Paula, sitting in this room saying, this is hard. Some of us are mad at each other. Some of us don't like each other right now. Some of us voted for different people. It's your fault. No, it's your fault. Like, all of that can be real and all of that can be true, and we can find the courage to stay in the room and be with each other in a different way. And I really do believe that, as much as people were sitting back, arms crossed, what's this gonna do? It's just a march. And then what? And then what are you doing the next day? For so many of us, even for those sitting back with their arms crossed, could not deny that there was a shift and a revolution on that day when we took to the streets and we stood up and said to each other, me too, me too, me too. I don't want to live in this. I don't want to live in this world that's manifesting. And for me, that was the beginning of, okay, there's an opening here. We can be with each other in a new way. And it inspired, all of this inspired my husband and I to start creating spaces where our artist community, our storytelling, narrative telling community could start to be with the activist, grassroots social justice movement community in a new way. Not in the transactional, will you tweet this? Will you donate something? Will you show up? Will you take a picture way, where no one comes away really excited or happy about that, but in a way where there is deep relationship and where we don't have to ask each other to keep showing up. Our relationship and our love for one another is what gets us up in the morning and inspires us to keep telling the stories and hearing and seeing each other. And so for me, that is the thread, and I think it goes to the Me Too moment, which obviously so many things had to happen to lay the foundation, starting with, Tarana Burke, who started Me Too in 2006 before there were hashtags. Acknowledging that every single speech, viral video, march, movement that happens, they don't exist in silos. They don't just disappear. We're building it together, and we're inspiring each other and showing what's possible. And I think those words, Me Too, again, were a new call to action to be with each other differently. If we as women, instead of seeing each other's pain and thinking, oh, I can't even think about that. That's too painful. Or, oh, that triggers me too much. Or, oh, how horrible for her. I hope she gets her justice. If instead of relating to each other in that way, we say to each other, you know what? I hear you and me too. And we are being with each other in that way, then look at what's possible. And the women who started that revolution, who started that movement, were not the most powerful, the most famous, the ones with the least to lose. They were the ones who had lost everything. They were the women who didn't have careers. You didn't know their names because they dare come out and tell their story. And only then, when they came out, did the more powerful, the more celebrated, and look, we all got to come to it the way we come to it, but that's not to shame anyone. That's only to say that every single one of us using our voice matters and encourages and inspires bravery in others. And, there would be no Time's Up with Me Too. And Time's Up was the exact same origin story. Me Too was happening, the stories were spreading, and women came together in our industry in an unprecedented way. Unprecedented. Women who were competitors, women who had been pitted against each other, women who had to fight tooth and nail to get where they were and only knew how to exist in the space in that way. We just knew that we couldn't do nothing, that was no longer an option. And there was no big plan. It was, let's just get into rooms and see what happens. And all of a sudden, we weren't execs and actresses and publicists and agents and lawyers working for certain companies. We were women. We were women in the same room who had experienced the same sort of imbalance of power and the same sort of humiliation, yes, from sexual assault, but in every other aspect of our lives and careers. And we knew that this isn't just about sexual assault. Sexual assault is one of the symptoms of a system that devalues women in every possible way you can imagine. And so being able to get into a space, as an actress, to just sit in a room with other actresses and to be able to see each other as not competition or the thing standing in your way, or believe what you heard about her, which is, oh, she's really difficult on set, and then who did you hear that from? Probably a man. And did you believe it? And did you believe it? Yes, I believed it. Why? Because I wanted to believe it, because I wanted the one role that was available for all 500 of us. And we knew we had to reckon not just with the system, but how we played a role in it and how we perpetuated it for ourselves and for each other. And literally being in the same room and seeing each other, subverting all the invisible lines that had kept us separate from each other, is what made it possible for us to take a step forward and to create Time's Up and to create a legal defense fund that is for men and women to share their stories. And it is continuing, and we are building it. It is imperfect, and we are trying to figure out how to be intersectional, and we are trying to figure out, how do we, create. How do we challenge a system without creating the same system? All these questions that are so hard when you get into these spaces, but like the Women's March women, modeled for us, of course it's hard. But we've got to just keep showing up, and we have to keep being in the space. And it's exhausting, and there are times when you want to be a deserter, or there are times you want to give up. And to bring it back to the theme of this panel and the reason we're here, the only reason, I think the main reason I keep showing up is because I know who's going to be in that room when I walk in that room. I know who's waiting for me. I know who's counting on me. I know who's going to show up and who's going to say, oh, where's America? Why isn't she here today? And I'm accountable to them. I'm accountable to my sisters. And they're the people who are in the fight with me.
Oh, Sharon, just.
I just want to say that's America, taken down a notch, because she asked to have the quiet version of her up here. So,
As a woman, as a rabbi, as someone living in LA and seeing the industry from the outside, but being part of it, but having this global perspective as a prophetic voice for this country, how are you interacting with this moment, with this movement?
So I will say that what we all know is that there's a lot of trauma that comes with this hashtag. I mean, there's a lot of real human suffering. And so, I found the first time I gave a sermon about it, which was like a week after Jodi Kantor's article came out in the New York Times, there were 35 people waiting afterwards to talk about it because they needed to be seen, like to say, this is my story. I need someone to actually see me and hold that with me. And like you, I felt this also, Linda, at the march that day. I mean, the prevailing feeling I left DC with after that day a year and a half ago was, I am not alone. And I think so many of us just felt so lonely and so alone. And all of a sudden we're like, no. There are a lot of good people on this side of history. And we just have to find each other and look at each other and tell our stories. And I mean, behind each one of these tweets and each Facebook post is a person in trauma. And that is something we have to learn how to hold tenderly each other's hearts. And I do feel like this particular piece of the work, the Me Too and Time's Up piece, has been about reminding us not only to fight against, but to fight for. We're not only fighting against this corrupt administration that's trying to decimate everything that so many of us hold dear. We are fighting for each other's lives and for our own lives. And there's a kind of tenderness that this moment, the acknowledgement of trauma and of personal trauma and vulnerability lifted to the surface. It's not just a political battle. I think the personal and the political are really entwined in every way. But I need love to hold me through this fight because I'm hurting, and so are you, and so are you. We need tenderness and we need care. I will say, and Valarie and I have spent some time talking about this, that one of the things that I've noticed in the Jewish community, I'll name this in the hope that it lifts up more conversations that need to be had, but that aren't yet being had. In minority communities, there's a tremendous resistance to speaking truth about the way that Me Too is actually affecting our own communities. And I had a conversation with a foundation head several months ago who was interviewing Jewish women professionals to try to understand if the ways in which we had been victims or survivors of sexual harassment and abuse within our own spaces. I'm talking about rabbis, federation heads, philanthropists. And we talked for 2 hours. And when we were done, he said, I have not interviewed one woman yet who said, oh no, I guess I'm the lucky one. I haven't had an experience like that. And the reason I think it's important to say, even though I say this with trepidation, is because, we all know that there's been a crazy spike in anti-Semitism in this country in the last 2 years. Like, I don't want to contribute to that. And I think that other minority communities similarly feel like, I'm not going to feed the worst impressions about the men in my community and about the dysfunction in my own family system. And yet, I also feel like that we're doing damage to our daughters and to our sons. And I feel that we have to, again, like holding tenderheartedness at the core here, because we are all very vulnerable in this moment. We have to tenderly pull back the veil on this thing and actually have these conversations inside our communities as well, because there's a lot that has not yet been written and has not yet been said that needs to, certainly in my community, and I'm sure that we're not alone here.
The sisters and nieces and daughters in my community, for too many of them, even the two words Me Too come with too great a cost. It's not just losing your job, it's being disowned by your family. It's not being able to get married. It's the shame that is brought upon an entire family. And so this is not the moment for my community, for Me Too to be on our lips, especially because if we call the police on our husbands and our sons and our nephews, then they might see them as Osama bin Laden in the flesh. They might pull the trigger earlier than they should. And I know that for too many undocumented women and Black women, it's the same cost. And so for you, America, this could have been a movement in Time's Up that was just for Hollywood women. And somehow, because you spent so much time being with other people, you knew how to model solidarity, you knew how to love us. And you created a way that even when it was too costly to speak, you couldn't speak yet, you still created this multi-million-dollar fund that would still support us, that would help us, that will further us along, because it's all connected. So that maybe 10, 20 years from now, our daughters are growing up in a different kind of world. So I think that this movement right now is embodying the ethic of revolutionary love that we are unpacking here together. You know, we're saying that we're pouring love in these three directions. And so we've talked about loving others, loving other women by having their backs. We talked about loving ourselves, taking that sisterhood in, honoring the deserter in us, but letting our sisters make us brave. And what we have yet to talk about is what it means to love our opponents. So what does it mean, then, to love the men who are most responsible for our oppression and for our ongoing, not only invisibility, but violence? Is there a pathway back to community for them? And what does that look like?
In 9 minutes, 4.5 minutes. You know, this has been something that has been on my mind a lot, and has been in the conversations that I've been having with women in these movement spaces. The questions about, you know, what about the men and how do we engage the men? And, you know, I don't think there are any easy answers, but in my mind, there is no, we're not doing anything if we're not healing all of us. And the punishment is not enough. Punishing men who have been raised in this culture, in this system, to not acknowledge or even be able to identify the ways in which they hate women, the ways in which they devalue women, you know, and also us women are also raised in the same culture of misogyny. We have to ask ourselves, what are the ways in which I hate women? What are the ways in which I hate myself and that I perpetuate onto my sisters? And how do I treat the men in my life in a way that can heal them and change them? And, you know, as the wife of a wonderful man, and I have a wonderful brother and wonderful nephews and men who I love, I don't want them living in a world where they are the bad guy. That's not the point. I don't want, you know, if I have a son one day, for him to look up and say, oh, it's women's turn now. You know, where does that leave him? What does that mean? We have to be better than the patriarchy that oppressed us. We need balance, and we need healing, and we need our men to heal. So much of their hatred for women is the ways in which we've taught them to hate themselves and to push down anything that is feminine in their own being. And I don't know the answers, but I know that our culture is creating these men. It is not outside of how we are raising men to become, what we are raising men to become, and what we are raising women to become in relation to them. And so I don't have the answers. I don't know what it looks like, but I know that we will never move forward if we don't find a way to heal the patriarchy and the system that we are all victims of. Men are victims of patriarchy.
Well, I don't have much to add to that. I think that was really beautifully said. And I have 2 girls. I have a little guy also. And I wonder what kind of table we're setting for these people. Like what are we teaching them? What are the values that we are sharing with them? And how much are we going to allow them to love not only one another, but also themselves? And in our tradition, there's this idea of tshuva, which means to return. It's like you've gone down the wrong path, now come back. And it's really hard work. For us, forgiveness comes not at the beginning, but the end of a really long, challenging journey that's both about trying to do healing where there's been brokenness, but also about transforming your heart and changing yourself. And the obligation is on the community to welcome back somebody who's a Baal Tshuva, who's gone through that process. And the reason why is because we've all caused harm, inadvertently or on purpose. Like we've all been on the other side. So the system is created in order to make it possible for us to not just live in our brokenness, but actually find ways to begin to heal. I don't know that our country right now is eager to have that piece of the conversation. And by the way, I'm not talking about Harvey Weinstein. And like whenever I talk about Nikudat Tova, like that everybody, there's this Hasidic idea that everybody has within them a point of pure good. Every single person. And you know, wherever I say that, someone raises, the first person raised their hand, really, Hitler had a point of pure good. I'm like, I'm not talking about Hitler, I'm talking about you. You have pure good in you. So I don't want to go, like, I'm not interested right now in thinking about a tshuva plan or like how do we reintegrate the most violent repeat offenders. I'm talking about if there are millions of women who posted #TimesUp, that means there are millions of men who affronted them, who insulted their dignity. Some of them didn't even realize it because, as you said, they were raised in a culture where that's what you do. You step on women and you humiliate women. You don't even necessarily know it's what you're doing. We have to go through a process of education and of healing and of welcoming back home. And I feel like that's our job now, to figure out how do we make tshuva, how do we turn this conversation around and begin to make space in our hearts, in our communities, to welcome back even the brokenness and start to make healing together.
So even the hardest conversations with my sisters always ends on a note of joy. So could you just say one thing that you do every day to keep you in joy?
I have breakfast with my husband and my 2 girls and my guy every morning. And it's just this tiny, like, little table that's really made for 2, but we fit 5 of us around it, and it's sun-drenched. And no matter what, we sit down at that table and we have breakfast before we all run out the door. And I feel like, like everything, if we can do this, just even hold this little bit of holiness for a moment together, then who knows what's possible.
I don't think that there's anything I do every day. I mean, I think right now is a very, very, very unique time for me as I'm pregnant with my first child. It's such a transformational period, and what I have learned in the process, or rather what I've been able to practice in the process, is creating the community that I need to get through this, and not just the happy, exciting, beautiful parts of it, but the really terrifying and scary parts of it, the sort of the soul searching and the deep trauma that comes through when you have more hormones surging through your body and less defenses to ignore what's happening. I think that for this feels like an act of surrender, and I feel like for the past couple of years I have felt only in a fighting stance, and I am being forced to surrender on a daily basis throughout this process, and that's a very, very hard thing for a fiery Aries, for someone like me who feels like I'm not doing enough, or there's so much work to do, or who else needs me, and what am I not doing, and I'm just sitting here. And surrendering has been a painful but educational process, and that's to a timeline and to a range of emotion that's so much bigger than what I can understand. And it feels like it requires, I'm not a religious person, but it requires a lot of faith to surrender. And so that's, I think, a daily practice for me right now.
You are both my joy. You keep me in joy every day, so thank you.
Thank you.